Good morning. On behalf of St. Paul Elder Services, we are very happy to have Sister Anne Marie Long come and share with us the faces of grief. I have heard Sister speak. She has a powerful message for us, and we are honored to have her come today. Welcome, Sister Anne Marie.
Thank you, Sister Dolores. And welcome to all of you who are joining us live by live stream or later today. If you're just finishing your day and you've worked all night, we hope that this is engaging enough to keep you awake. And for those of you who are just beginning your day, welcome to a new day given to us by the Lord. What qualifies me to be here? That might be the question. Who are you and what qualifies you to be here? Well, I'm a Franciscan Sister of Christian Charity. I served for, I think, 13 years on the board of directors for St. Paul Elder Services, for which I'm very grateful. It's a wonderful institution. And I have a master's degree in applied spirituality. So I'm a spiritual director, I give retreats, I give workshops. And so that in itself is the background. Now, my personal experiences of grief, I think, have helped me a great deal understand more about grief. When my sister was 16 years old, she was killed by a drunk driver in a driving accident, and I was about 20. So that was a very sudden grief and a very different kind of grief because it's so unexpected. That was in 1969. In 2002, my mother was diagnosed with a fourth-stage cancer in April, and another shock, my father died in June. So we're expecting my mother to pass, and my father dies, and then my mother dies 6 months later in January. So I have experienced sudden grief, and I've experienced prolonged grief with my parents and in my family. So what to do with all those feelings? Or as I was talking about this with one of the other sisters the other day, she said, you just wonder, how can the sun come up in the morning? How can all these people be driving on the road when my father or my mother just died, or someone I love just died? So you have this feeling of unbelief, like, is the world going to keep going or is it going to stop because of my grief? So those are things that we can explore today. But one of the things I learned in a class that my mom and I took shortly after my sister was killed, a great piece of advice, and the instructor said, always put your grief to work. So though this sounds quite removed from grief, the process is grief will stay stuck in us unless we can move it through our minds, bodies, hearts, and souls and move it out. So the goal of grief is to feel it and to move it. So put your grief to work was the message Mom and I got from this course. So my mom joined Mothers Against Drunk Driving. If you're old, I don't know how active that group is today, but if you're old enough to know when they put red flags, little red ribbons and so forth on people's, when we still had antennae on cars and trucks. And she helped organize different events. And I began talking to high school students about drinking and driving, though the person who was the cause of this accident was not a high school student. He was a dad and a neighbor, but still the effects of alcohol and alcoholism on the family and also on the victims of things that go on when someone is not fully present, as they are in being drunk. Those are things that help us understand a little bit better our responsibility to make the world a better place. Our talk today on grief is not just about COVID grief. We've all experienced different forms of grief as we have moved through phase 1 and now phase 2, maybe phase 3, whatever phase we're in of COVID. That is one kind of grief. But there are many kinds of grief, so this talk is not just about COVID grief, but about all the different kinds of grief we can experience. And that you'll find a lot of this right on the handout, so you could follow along, and then there will be time for you to ask any questions or give any comments at the end. One of the kinds of grief that we may experience, especially now during the time of COVID, was a loss of celebrations. We couldn't celebrate birthdays in the same way. I had twins in my family graduating from high school with no ceremony. Their parents could drive them through the park. They could hop out of the car and have their picture taken with the principal and get their diploma, hop back in the car, and go back home again. That was the extent of graduation. Then completing their first year of college in their kitchen at home online. So all that loss and all that change in our normal life is a cause for grief. Some people have missed weddings, or weddings had to be postponed, or they were private weddings. We miss going to church services, gathering for wakes and funerals, and the tremendous loss that we have when someone dies, and we couldn't have any closure in our usual ways of wakes and funerals and so forth. So that's one kind of loss. Another kind of loss many of us felt was the inability to see loved ones, the inability to say goodbye. As I said, missing a wake or a funeral, the loss of income. Some of our small business people, some of our people who were independently working, they've lost their job, there's no call. And on the other end, people ordering furniture and carpeting and so forth sometimes have to wait months before they can have that done. The workforce diminished. And furniture, one of my friends ordered furniture and they told her it would be available in 9 months or so. I guess it's really hard to get a car too, because the supply chain is limited. So that's another kind of grief, especially if you're a young person looking forward to buying that first car, if you're an elderly couple that's looking for a car that will serve their retirement well, another kind of loss. Also, the loss of pets, or the death of pets, can be very devastating. We know that many people consider the pet a member of their family, and though it is a different kind of loss than a human loss, it can form a big vacuum in a family, especially with all the members of the family, the children and so forth. If you're a parent or a grandparent, you know the many questions and the many ways that young people and children might deal with grief, which may be different than the way we as adults deal with it. And number 4 on the outline there, a loss of educational normalcy, how we begin school, how we end school, how we conduct school, how the children play together, learn together. All those different facets from preschool and even daycare all the way up through university classes. My one great nephew has been greatly affected. He just doesn't want to learn anything that involves a computer, because he spent the last year of his high school year learning, virtually. For some, they excel that way. For some, they don't. So those are other kinds of losses. In number 5, the loss of health. So sometimes dying might seem more efficient, but it's that long process of disease or aging or accidents. So another kind of loss. The loss of family and friend, especially in relationships, because of political or religious differences. The loss of relationships because of the different vaccine participation or lack of participation. Those are other stresses that we have no model, we have no blueprint for dealing with some of the political, religious, and health situations that we've faced in the last several years. So another form of grief, but they're all grief, and they work through us. Then there's collective or group grief. That is grief felt by an entire group, a civic community, an entire family, an entire parish. And certainly here you experience that at St. Paul Elder Services, that all of you have lost a client, or all of you have lost a beloved worker, or all of you grieve with someone who has lost someone else, either by death, by COVID, or another kind of death, all of those kinds of things. Another area that I guess I hadn't thought too much about until I tried to put this talk together is anticipatory grief. That is a grief that begins before someone dies. So that can be the grief of death, anticipating the death by cancer, by dementia, by aging. So sometimes we're grieving a year or more because we know something is coming. We know a loved one is going to die, or we know ourselves that we are on the process of slowly dying because of what has happened to us. So anticipatory grief. And the box there you see at the bottom right says, and I thought that summed it up so well, one of the hardest things you will ever have to do, my dear, is to grieve the loss of a person who is still alive. And you know how that can break our hearts when we're watching a loved one go through a process, and there's absolutely nothing we can do to change that process, the tremendous feeling of helplessness. I was talking to a nurse practitioner not too long ago, and I said, what was the hardest part of this whole COVID situation for you? She said, I have never met anything that had no cure and no treatment. We didn't even know what drug we could give a person that would ease their comfort, or how to treat COVID, or the procedures that went along with trying to alleviate someone's pain. She said, I've never had that. There's always been something I could do. And she said there was nothing. We were absolutely helpless in the face of something that we knew nothing about. Also, I hear some people being very angry at the CDC or Dr. Fauci or whomever you're listening to, because we think, it looks like, they keep changing their mind. But I said to one of the sisters one day, well, the way I understand this is that we're building a plane while it's flying. We don't know all the ins and outs. And in science, scientists are very comfortable with the fact that I think this is what it is, but I'm open to experimenting and seeing if I am correct, or if I have to scrap the idea and move on. Most of us are not used to that in our daily life. We're used to having an answer or a prediction. But in science, you think something's going to work, and then it doesn't work. Or you think it's transmitted one way, but then we find out it's transmitted in another way. So that's a lot of grief as well, the helplessness in the face of the unknown. In that little box toward the top of the right, I found this later, and I just began to cry when I read it. When I sat with my anger long enough, it told me its name was grief. So sometimes you find a lot more anger going on in families, more road rage, more gun violence, and sometimes we mistake our anger for really profound grief, that things are not the way they used to be, things are not the way I want them to be, and it comes out as anger, but it could also be grief. And I remember saying to my provider, my health provider, this was during COVID, I said, I am so angry at some of the other sisters, and they really haven't done anything to warrant that anger, but I just feel so angry. And then I read this quote, that was grief. The grief of having social and things disrupted, and again, this feeling of helplessness. So another way that grief shows itself. One indication of exaggerated or prolonged grief is nightmares, self-destructive behaviors, drug abuse, thoughts of suicide, abnormal fears, and the development or emergence of psychiatric disorders. This sounds, like, how does that play itself out. But I remember the first time after we were vaccinated and we could go move about freely, there were a couple months in there before the Delta variant came. And I remember thinking, I don't remember how to socialize very much outside of the people I've been living with. What am I going to wear and what am I going to say? I have never felt the inability to socialize or to deal with people, but it's like, I forgot how to act. For the first time in a year, I drove on Highway 41, and there were 4 or 5 lanes of traffic, and I go, oh my, I haven't done this for so long. I haven't driven in this kind of traffic. Little things like that all of a sudden come to our awareness, and we think, oh my goodness, what has my life turned into just in a year or so? So those are ways that grief is manifested through anxieties that we might never have been anxious about. I was never anxious about going to a buffet. Now, I wouldn't go to a buffet. I wouldn't touch the same utensils other people have touched because I've grown in that awareness. Another form of grief that sometimes we don't think about is a lost childhood. And that is a person now, maybe an adult or a teen, who never had a chance to be a child because they were being physically abused or sexually abused or verbally abused, when we sometimes don't understand the significance of verbal abuse, criticizing, parents making fun of children, or teasing them mercilessly, or telling them that they're not able to do something. They're not strong enough or they're not smart enough. That's a lost childhood. Psychological abuse, suicide in the family, or a rupture in family relationships. Those are all forms of grief. So you might be very angry with your brother-in-law or your sister-in-law or your grandpa for X, Y, or Z, whatever the reason. That is a form of grief. The anger really is grief. So another thing we want to be careful of, and that's in number 11 there, entitlement behaviors. You see this a lot in schools, and I was made aware of this by a psychologist when I was working with teens, and some of them would just break every rule. If there was a rule, they'd go against it. Self-medicating through food, alcohol, drugs, chemicals. Children do this, and adults do this. And it's called an entitlement behavior. Because I am sad, because I am angry, because my father is an alcoholic, because my mother has mental issues, because school is hard for me, I am entitled to break rules. I don't have to follow rules because my life is hard enough without following all these rules beside. So we call that entitlement behavior. There's a reason people do what they do. So we look at what's behind this kind of rule-breaking, drug abuse, and so forth. And very often it's grief or a loss, like they say here, a loss of childhood, which is a form of grief. So another facet of grief. There are 4 points I put together in a box there that I've come to as my own realization as a spiritual director and a facilitator of workshops and so forth. I try to stress that death is not the end of a relationship. After death, you are perfectly understood by the deceased person. So I have had people come and say, I didn't visit my mother as often as I should. I didn't help my dad as often as I should. So there are all kinds of regrets. And my question is, why would you torture yourself? You did the best you could with the circumstances you had. Once somebody dies, they don't carry any grudges against you because they understand perfectly you did the best you could. Even if other times in your life you may have done better, you still did the best you could at that situation. And I remember thinking of that when, as my mother was dying, I said to myself every day, do your best, no regrets. Because the torture that people can give themselves after a death can be excruciating. And there's no reason for it. Sometimes they think they would be dishonoring the dead person if they went on with their life. But the purpose, again, of grief is to feel it and move it. So, you don't have to worry about someone who has died. They understand everything. So you don't have to torture yourself. Next point, do not torture yourself replaying self-defeating phrases. If only I had done this, I wish I could have done that, I should have done this, we could have done that. Why wasn't there a cure for that when my mother was dying of that, and now there's a cure for it or a treatment for it? So that's torture. Keep going through all those phrases rather than saying, I did the best I could, everybody did the best they could, and move on. Blaming, finger pointing are normal but unhealthy when they are prolonged. And I know people who the child has been in a car accident and the mother started torturing herself. I shouldn't have let her take the car. I shouldn't have done this. And the dad saying, your word and my word are equal. Don't start torturing yourself with you should have not done this or you should have done that. Because there's no reason, there's no good that comes out of that kind of self-torture. And again, a little advice, put your grief to work. Plan a memorial, write a letter to the person, and what do you do with the letter? You might save it, you might tear it up, you might burn it, you might bury it in the ground someplace, but it's a kind of ritual, and you might do this over and over again. It's a kind of ritual to move the grief through yourself. Or donate to a cause in someone's memory. Honor the person by donating something to the dementia program or to alcoholism or whatever it might be. So those are some suggestions of moving grief along. On the back of the page, I also learned a lot about delayed grief. So grief can come in many different forms, and sometimes it's delayed. You might find yourself grieving now about something that happened 20 years ago. You're not crazy, the grief has now come up, and it's time to deal with it. And sometimes we can't experience the grief when it's happening because we had to plan the funeral, we had to take care of mom or dad if the other parent died, we have children of our own, we have a business to run or work to do, and there's no time to really grieve. And then we might get sick, or we might have time on a vacation, and we're wondering, why is all this stuff coming up now when that happened so long ago? And it's coming up because you haven't had a chance to deal with the grief yet. So how do we look at delayed grief? What are some of the symptoms? You've put off grieving. You might find there are different ways that grief comes out. It might be headaches, irritability, aches and pains, anxiousness, mood swings, feeling numb and apathetic. If that's not your usual way of proceeding with life, if you're not suffering with some kind of disorder, and you find these things happening, it could be delayed grief. And everyone grieves differently. There's no one good way. There's no one good way to grieve. There's no one right way to grieve. The only way to grieve is the way you are and how it's happening. I'll let you read that next section yourself, what causes delayed grief. But going to the next part, then what do you do about it? You look after your health, you talk to friends and family, you make time to thank the grief. Thank you for your own mental health. Be grateful for nature or beauty. I remember one of the sisters saying she got through the lockdown on COVID by going outside. She said the birds, the animals, none of them know about COVID. There's no COVID out here. So there's the beautiful nature that healed her while she was in a lot of isolation. So thank, avoid unhealthy coping strategies. One of my clients was telling me that on Friday night she usually had a cocktail with a friend. And as COVID progressed, she had a cocktail on Thursday and Friday night. Then on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night. And pretty soon, without thinking, she found herself that she was drinking some alcohol every single night. And she said, when I realized that's how I was coping, I had to stop right away before a bigger problem. And of course, she wasn't addicted, and that's another whole procedure. But she was aware that this is one way she was coping with the isolation and the grief. So good for her that she realized that. And I just had a session with her not too long ago, and I said, and how's the alcohol? And she said, just once a week. That's it. So I could tell the realization and the renewed health. And then there's also, as you see on the handout, incomplete grief, which is like delayed grief, just another way of looking at it. Some people, like I heard of people who are continually play a video of the loved one 2, 3, 4 years after they die, or they won't go out to eat with anyone because they feel it would dishonor the deceased husband or wife or child. So that obsessing, going over and over and over again, something that cannot change. It will not change, but our attitude can change, and we can look after our own health. We want to, again, be aware of addictive or self-harming behaviors, or some people respond with apathy. They feel nothing. Someone said to me the other day, it was interesting, he was putting a lot of effort into a learning difficulty that his son has, and he said, now one way to cope with that would be buy a case of beer and sit in the living room and forget all about it. He said, that would be a way of doing this, but he said, that's not a good way, of course. But it was just that thought that, yeah, I could just drink and forget about this, and, but the trouble is the next day you gotta deal with it again anyway. But it is a temptation to at least get rid of some of that pain. I've given you also some web links there if you would like, and I think, yes, I have my email on the front of the page, so if you would like me to send those links live to you, right on the bottom of the front page, I have my name, my cell phone number, and my email address, and I could send this to you as an electronic file if you don't want to type in 100 words there to get the resources of some of this in case you'd like to deal with it any further. All right, our time is just about up. I would invite any comments or questions that you might have. And it's okay if you don't, too. Okay, well, I thank you for your kind attention, and hopefully if there's just one thing in here that will help you to deal with your grief or someone else's grief in a healthy manner, then my purpose is accomplished. So thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Sister.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Beautiful. It's good to know.